Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Welcome to Prestige Part 6, I believe it is. It's a massive canon, the Prestige body of work. And like I said, it's on par with Blue Note for much of its history, and they parallel each other. When it's hard bop at Blue Note, it's hard bop at Prestige. When it's soul jazz at Prestige, it's soul jazz at Blue Note. No two labels in the jazz kingdom mirror each other more. Riverside fits in that same cast for a while, but they fold by 62, so they don't really fall into the soul jazz. They get some kind of experimental, edgy stuff, which ends up on Jazzland and a little bit late in the Riverside sequence. But it's when avant-garde's happening at Blue Note, they're dabbling in it at Prestige on the New Jazz label. So there's a lot of parallels, a lot of the same musicians, a lot of the same sidemen. Rudy Van Gelder's mastering and engineering a lot of the same sessions. They're very synonymous. They're not the same entity for sure. Different guidelines, principles run them. I had someone message me the other day talking about the difference in the sound of Rudy Van Gelder Prestige versus Rudy Van Gelder Blue Note. And he made a few interesting points. I agreed with most of them, if not all of them. It's not something I sit really around and listening to myself. I don't really approach it that way. But obviously some people do. If you come from an engineering background, you're going to be listening to the room and the space and the echo and the reverb and delay. Again, that's not really something I pay much attention to very often. Once in a while, something will really jump out at me. But for the most part, what I notice engineering, it's if something's not loud enough. You know, if one of the horns is too quiet, or vocals too loud. That's the stuff I kind of notice from engineering and production. I love production. I'm much more aware of production values and the arrangement and value and the overarching production of a session. That's something I'm very conscious of. The engineering aspects of it are something I don't really pay nearly as much attention to as some people do. And it's definitely a part of the story. So it's good that some people do think about that stuff. But today we're going to talk about the first 62 New Jazz. And New Jazz is going to have been coming out simultaneously as a lot of that 7,100 series was coming out. And so you're going to see the other side of the coin for Prestige here at New Jazz. And remember, which we'll cover in the next episode, Swingsville and Moodsville are also happening simultaneously as well. We're going to talk about the first 62 New Jazz today because I have all those in that sequence. And there's only about 120 total. I start missing some after 8262. Prestige was always in that 7,000 sequence. They give New Jazz an 8200 sequence, which they probably felt was far enough away from the 7,000 number that they weren't going to bump into each other. But the Prestige 7000 does make it almost to 8,000. So they almost made it all the way through that loop. But 8200 through 120 or so, there's quite a bit of stuff that's doubled up. That was released on Prestige, got reissued on New Jazz. There's quite a bit of stuff that was issued on New Jazz that gets a later Prestige cover and album and release that was already released on New Jazz. So it goes both ways. But there's also a lot of great new material here. Most of the more edgy, avant-garde, compositionally driven, experimental, interesting instruments like the Dorothy Ashby harp. A lot of that stuff, they decide they're going to put that stuff on New Jazz and leave the 7000 series to become more soul jazz at that point. Plus your Monk, Rollins, Miles, Coltrane, reissue vault stuff. I'm not sure if there was a price difference between the two. I'm pretty sure there was between Riverside and Jazzland, at least initially. And Jazzland was initially meant as kind of a budget reissue thing, but then they ended up putting a lot of new material out there. I don't think New Jazz was a budget thing ever. I don't know if they were cost less or possibly more. I don't know. But like they were coming out simultaneously. It would be kind of cool to, at one point, look week by week or month by month the releases that the Prestige Canon is putting out between those 4 labels in 58, 59, 60, 61, there must have been some months where they put out a dozen records easily between those 4 labels. It's pretty non-stop. It's an impressive body of work, as I've said numerous times. This is an old LA Kings jersey, by the way, hockey jersey. And a lot of people don't know this, but the LA Kings wore the purple and gold before the Lakers did. When the Lakers came from Minneapolis to LA, they were navy blue and white. And they stayed that until 71 or so, 69, 70. And the Kings come into existence in 66, 67. And they went purple and gold with that kind of King Royal purple and the gold. And the Lakers ended up kind of copying that. And, of course, the Lakers are now renowned for the purple and gold. And the Kings, of course, have changed to black and silver at this point. But classic old 60s, 70s LA King hockey jersey. The great Bernie Nichols. When Gretzky went to LA, Nichols netted like 72 goals that first year that Gretzky was there. And he was a career like 35 goal scorer before that. So Gretzky doubled his scoring that year. That's how great a playmaker Gretzky was. It's a cool old jersey. So let's dive into New Jazz, the first 62. It's some great stuff, some tricky stuff, some reissue stuff, but we'll go through it as we get there. All right, let's dive in. So this is Mal Waldron 3. And if you recall, Mal Waldron 1 and 2 were on the Prestige 7000 sequence. And this is his 3rd release now, 8201, in the New Jazz sequence. And Mal, you know, he's a fairly modern compositional type player, an interesting New York-born guy. This is a Japanese pressing, very tough record to come by. Originals are just about impossible to find. 8202 is a session kind of led by Idris Suleiman, though it's not really led by anyone in some context. Frank Rehak, great trombonist, Jimmy Cleveland again, Pepper Adams, Cecil Payne, a couple baritonists, Tommy Flanagan, Bill Evans on the piano, Doug Watkins, Lewis Hayes, and Elvin Jones. That would make me think that might be from 2 different sessions. This is not that tough a record to find for a New Jazz imprint, and for some reason, maybe it's supposed to be like that. Yeah, it's from 2 different sessions for sure. But great stuff with a lot of great modern players. And early on here, some of this stuff could have still been on the 7000 sequence without question. But this is how Weinstock chose to do it. So number 8203 is a very collectible and hard to find record, Farmer's Market by Art Farmer. I was thrilled when I finally found an OJC of that, because that's a rare record, even OJC wise. It's just a tough thing to come by. Cool little cover. It's got a nice group on it with Kenny Drew on the piano. Hank Mobley is on the saxophone. Addison Farmer and Elvin Jones is on the drums. And that's again one of those records I told you, because Hank Mobley's on it. The Mobley guys want it. So that record goes for $100 easily on a regular basis. Even the OJC stuff can go for $50, $60 nowadays. This is Phil Woods, Bird Feathers, 8204. He plays with Gene Quill here, a guy he plays with quite a lot over the years. Jackie McLean, John Jenkins, Hal McCusick. And again, I think it's from several different sessions. It's from 3 different sessions. And so initially here, some of this stuff feels a bit like they're throwing scraps together, but it's still valuable stuff and worthwhile looking for. Midnight Oil by the great Jerome Richardson. One of the most unheralded and forgotten about players of the hard bop modern era is Jerome Richardson. He's a fantastic flautist, a great sax player. He's very integral in a lot of great arranged modern jazz. His work as a leader is minimal, and two of his main works are here on the New Jazz label. His work as a sideman is completely prolific. It's pages of work. He showed up on so many sessions beyond just the scope of jazz. You gotta love Jerome Richardson. He's a name duly worth more praise than he's given. Steve Lacy plays Felonious Monk. Reflections, a nice album cover. Both his albums on Prestige have that kind of lime yellow color. Lacy, believe it or not, was a big Monk fan and does Monk compositions throughout his career. He found Monk's songs challenging and interesting and was always willing to put his spin on what Monk had written. And so Lacy's kind of interwoven with Monk, even though I don't think he ever played with Monk in his career. I could be wrong, but I don't think he did. 8207 from 58 is the New York Scene, a great album cover. You got a reflection of New York in the glass of a skyscraper. That's got the George Wallington, Phil Woods, Donald Byrd group on it. And Wallington plays with Byrd on a number of sessions. Again, just a great album cover. Great modern hard bop from 58 with elements of some modernity and some edges on it at times. Here's Mal Waldron 4, Mal Waldron New Jazz, 8208. So again, this stuff's all coming out at the same time as Swingville's being launched, Moodsville's being launched, Prestige is going late 7000s or into 7100s. So there's a lot of stuff cooking at Prestige simultaneously, and their decisions to put stuff where, on some levels, seem arbitrary, even though there is a general kind of consensus to it. This is Dorothy Ashby with Frank West. And again, they had a record on the Prestige sequence. They moved their second one here to New Jazz 8209. Sadly, that OBI strip is right there in the way, unfortunately. But it's a Japanese pressing. Another record that's really tough to find. Frank West, Herman Wright, and Roy Haynes is on that. A lot of these New Jazz titles are really some of the rarest records of the established jazz canon. A lot of these artists are very established members of the canon. The label is OJC, and OJC reissues a lot of the 7000 sequence, 7100 sequence. They reissue quite a bit of the New Jazz sequence, but there's numerous titles in the New Jazz that didn't get OJC treatment, which has made them incredibly rare and incredibly expensive. And some of these New Jazz titles go for money similar to what Blue Note originals go for. And the Japanese, thankfully, have reissued pretty much the entire thing. This is We 3, great record, 8210 from 58, with Roy Haynes, Phineas Newborn, and Paul Chambers. Chambers kind of towers over Roy and Phineas there. Roy, of course, is a drummer that's on the scene from the bebop days up until the present. He's still playing. And Phineas is a wonderful player from Tennessee who has a lot of vibrant playing, interesting melodic choices with interesting rhythmic comping. I've always been a big fan of Phineas. I love his first record on Atlantic quite a lot. Just Wailing, 8211. Herbie Mann takes the lead here, along with Charlie Rouse, Kenny Burrell, and Mal Waldron. Again, they're all kind of equally billed, honestly. And you have the horse there from the merry-go-round. Just Wailin', great record. This is still Herbie Mann playing traditional jazz. Ain't no shades of his commercial pop stuff here yet whatsoever. Charlie Rouse is one of the great tenor players that kind of goes unheralded to some degree. You always got to love Kenny Burrell. The section's rounded out by George Joyner on the bass and Art Taylor on the drums. But so that's numerous of these records here. A lot of these guys are kind of getting equal billing. You see it in the We 3. We see it here in this Just Wailing. We saw it on the New York Scene. We saw it on this Bird Feathers. We saw it on this Roots record. They're not clearly defined sessions, but they're really great modern jazz recordings filled with a lot of hunger and drive. 8212 is McLean, and McLean's making records at Prestige 56, 57, 58, and then he goes to Blue Note. McLean's kind of in his transitional phase here from being a pretty outstanding Parker bebop kind of stylist into his own sound and own voice. He's, of course, struggling with drugs, as a lot of these guys were. But he ends up becoming a fairly big voice in the modern avant-garde scene, especially once he gets to Blue Note. But this is part of Jackie's development. Again, a record that originals go for big money. Ray Bryant, Alone with the Blues, a big Ray Bryant guy, as I said, in the 7000 sequence. A great rhythm and blues styled player. His probably two best records as a leader are his two records here on Prestige and New Jazz. A lot of his other kind of records as leaders are kind of more commercial leaning with Columbia and Sue and other labels that he's on. But great record, great cover. Long Island Sound, Stan Getz. Interesting, it's a great cover, honestly. Got the little melancholic boat sitting there in the harbor. It's a great cover. It's kind of an in-demand record, but it's actually music that Prestige has put out twice before. They put it out here, 7002. That's Stan Getz. It's the same songs, but they also, this is a release of earlier 10-inch material from 50 and 51 when it was recorded. So there's 3 versions of these sessions, and strangely enough, it seems to be that version on New Jazz is the one that people are looking for, even though it's the last of the 3 to be reissued. The cover is part of that, I think, but also I think it's the Prestige, oddly enough, of the New Jazz imprint. You like how I use that pun on words there? The Prestige of New Jazz. But yeah, that's a pretty in-demand record. I hear a lot of people messaging me, oh, I'm looking for the new Long Island Sound. I often tell them, like, there's actually other versions of that that are more original and less expensive. This is Big Stuff, Gil Evans and Band, New Jazz. This is also a reissue of a 7,000 sequence title. Let me look real quick here. It's a reissue of 7120. So it's basically a reissue of his album where he's a leader in the Prestige sequence, which I showed you last episode. 8216 is Teddy Charles Coolin, one of the rarest records on the New Jazz imprint. John Jenkins shows up here, Idris Suleiman, Mal Waldron. Great cover, just cats cooling it off in the summertime. Charles, of course, has some modern cool in his sound and his composition. And he's got some pretty edgy guys there with Idris and John Jenkins. So it's just a great mix of what's happening in jazz in 1959. Here's another record from 59. Tommy Flanagan, John Coltrane, Kenny Burrell, and it's called The Cats. Of course, The Cats. And so Flanagan is given sort of leadership here, but it's kind of a Coltrane session equally. It's often seen as kind of a Flanagan-Coltrane co-led session. But this was actually recorded in 57, where most of John Coltrane's work at Prestige was recorded in 57 to 58. It just wasn't released until 59. Again, it's an OJC reissue. And thank goodness for OJC giving us copies that were $6. Nowadays they're $20, $30. But it's a lot more affordable than the $200, $300 the originals go for if you can find them. And I don't think that the New Jazz titles got printed in as great a volume as the Prestige titles did either. And some of that's demand, some of that's expectation of sales. They know some of this modern stuff's not going to have as broad an appeal as the soul jazz or as the Miles Davis stuff. But it seems like a lot of New Jazz titles got a few runs maybe, and then they were just kind of discontinued. And so they're really a rare breed in this Prestige family. Even the Moodsville, Swingsville stuff are much easier to find, even though they were somewhat niche as well. Here's Yusef Lateef, Other Sounds, 8218. Yusef's such an interesting player. You see him there with the flute in his mouth, but he was also a very adept saxophonist, great composer and arranger. Brought a lot of interesting world sounds to the music, and played everything from world instruments to he played balloons on some songs. I was chatting with someone about that the other day. So a pretty creative, inventive guy. 8219 is Taylor's Tenors, and we remember Taylor's Wailers. That was in the 7000 sequence. They gave Art Taylor another session here on New Jazz with Frank Foster, the great bassy saxophonist, and Charlie Rouse, again, who I'm a big fan of. And the back is all in Japanese, so there's not a lot more information I can give you off the top of my head on that. But it's a great record. I've listened to it a lot. And Art's, of course, one of the great drummers of this era, showing up on so many sessions. Benny Golson makes 3 or 4 records here in the New Jazz imprint. And a lot of these Benny Golson titles, for reasons unknown, didn't get OJC reprints, which has made these very rare and very collectible and in demand. And it's also increased the demand for the Japanese pressings, because sometimes that's the only version you can find. The Benny Golson New Jazz stuff, along with the G.G. Grice stuff, which I'll show you, are all very, very rare, but very great records. You know, fantastic bands on them, great compositions, hard driving tempos. This has Curtis Fuller, who works with Benny Golson quite a lot, Ray Bryant, Paul Chambers, and Art Blakey. So again, that's a Blue Note quality lineup without question. Here's 8221, Johnny Smith, All Soul. So Johnny Smith, great organ player, very much inspired by Jimmy Smith on the organ. A guy with a lot of chops. The guy can really play. He's probably almost equal to Jimmy Smith as a player, and Jimmy was an absolute virtuoso. Johnny's a great innovator. He's a brilliant player. He's also a good song arranger, and he makes a lot of great records at Riverside as well. But he starts showing up here pretty thick in the New Jazz sequence. This was one of those records where I bought it on Discogs. Didn't realize I didn't have the cover. Then I found another one eventually. Modern Jazz Disciples. If I remember, they're out of Cincinnati. Here they're a quintet. I think they're a quartet in their next release. I can't remember for sure. But it's great driving somewhere between the Three Stones with Stanley Turrentine and a little harder than that, but not as hard as the Jazz Messengers. Like it's fairly rhythm and blues driven and accessible. Got some gospel and blues to it for sure. Here's the great Lem Winchester, a fantastic vibraphonist, playing again with Benny Golson. Another one of those records that's pretty tough to come by. Lem was a pretty special player. Lem was one of those cats that, for him, jazz was a side job, a hobby. He was a cop in Delaware, and he had gotten proficient enough and as a good enough a player that he ends up being brought to Newport Jazz Festival, I think in '58, and he made such an impact there that he was able to quit being a cop, and he records some great records here. There's one on Metro Jazz, a couple other labels as well. He makes some really good records. Sadly, he dies in a gun incident. I don't know all the details. I think he was playing with a loaded gun and somehow ends up shooting himself. Sad end, but he was a great player, and his work is really brilliant, to be quite honest. Here's Oliver Nelson. This is his first on New Jazz. He's probably already got a few on Prestige at this point. Again, at this point, he's very much still the saxophone player. Very modern, very much like Coltrane. He's seeking and searching a lot, but he's not nearly the avant-gardist that Coltrane was. Here he's playing with Kenny Dorham on the trumpet and Ray Bryant. And I think the rhythm section has Wendell Marshall and Art Taylor. Pretty safe guesses. Oliver, again, he's a very creative guy. By the mid-'60s, he's pretty much just arranging, and eventually he gets into television and film, and he ends up in that genre for quite a while until he meets an early death sometime in the '70s. We lost Oliver Nelson. But at this point in his career, he's still very much still a player, and he does some great work here at Prestige and New Jazz. Quite a bit of buzz about this record. Kenny Dorham, Quiet Kenny, 8225. It was just reissued recently and sold out very quickly. It went for big money. That was issued on OJC. There should be OJC copies out there somewhere, but again, even the OJC stuff's getting really rare and tough to come by. Kenny's a great player, somewhere between a Donald Birdley Morgan, and probably not as forceful as a Morgan, probably more like a Bird, not as soft as an Art Farmer or Miles Davis, not as cloudy. So there's a lot of variation in trumpet tone, from the cloudiness of a Miles Davis to the cleanness of a Clifford Brown, and Dorham tends to fall in the middle of that somewhere. And there's quite a variation, like I said, in the kingdom of trumpet players, almost a rainbow's worth of different sounds that different trumpet players kind of rely on. One of the toughest records for me to find in the sequence, I'll believe it or not, was the second Jerome Richardson record, Roaming with Richardson, 8226. This was a Japanese pressing, of course, but I found it in America, which meant my shipping was really affordable. I ended up getting that for like 20 bucks. And I had been looking at it online for well over 100, especially from Japan, and never pulled the trigger. And then one day this popped up in a store in America. Maybe it was 30 bucks, but it was a steal, and I jumped on it right away. It was something I looked for a long time and never could find. Great record, great cover, great Jerome Richardson. Here's Ray Bryant's record. We already covered this in the 7000 sequence where it was also issued. And that's his 2 records at Prestige. Moving along here to 8228 is the great tuba player Ray Draper. And we saw his other record in the 7000 sequence. Here he's playing with John Coltrane. And so when you play with Coltrane, play with guys like Jackie McLean, it brings you a certain amount of prestige and validation almost off the bat. Ray could really play, but Ray could also shoot the needle, and he ends up spending a long time in prison, sadly. 8229 is more Johnny Hammond Smith. Again, a great player. And some of these have some soul jazz, a bit more modern than soul jazz, but they certainly have elements of soul jazz to them. And so why the Johnny Hammond Smiths were put here and not in the 7100 sequence? Again, it's not always that clear. This is Gigi Grice saying something, and this is a tough record to find. 8230, Japanese pressing. Just great modern composition. A lot of angles, a lot of hints of dissonance. Just, again, one of the great composers of this era. Richard Williams, Richard Wyans, Reggie Workman, and Granville Mickey Roker are on the band on that one. Grice was a bit of a pariah, a bit of an outsider, wasn't much of a conformist, always kind of wanted to do his own thing. And he ends up out of jazz by the early 60s. He's moved on, and I think he makes a few resurfacing, but he had some issues with his self-confidence and just some things I read about him. He was a fragile guy in some ways, but super talented. And again, if you have a chance to get a Gigi Grice new jazz record, you should never pass that up. Jackie McLean making the changes. Again, he's got a lot of work coming out between Prestige and between New Jazz, and he's going to be at Blue Note shortly here. 59 this came out, and so he's probably getting ready to sign with Blue Note at this point. That New Soil record comes out in probably 60. Here's a cool record with John Jenkins, Clifford Jordan, and the great piano player Bobby Timmons. Again, the 3 of them are kind of equally billed there. Great modern composition. There's a rhythm section with this too, isn't there? Yeah, with Wilbur Ware and Danny Richmond. Danny Richmond, of course, was a drummer who played with Mingus for the longest time. Oliver Nelson, Taking Care of Business, 8233. Johnny Hammond Smith and Lem Winchester are both on this, giving this one kind of a soul jazz feel, to be honest. When you have Lem Winchester on the vibes, Johnny Hammond organ on the Smith, you got the soulful sounds of Oliver Nelson. It's just going to be a much more rhythm and blues, soul jazz sounding thing. Cry Tender, Yusef Lateef, 8234. Yusef is a prolific recorder. He makes a lot of records at Savoy in 56, 57. He moves on to Prestige. He's making a ton of music here. He has a couple at Argo and Verve mixed in there. And then, of course, he moves on to Impulse, where he makes a great string of records. There's probably 25 Yusef Lateef records that I think are just essential parts of the canon, and one of the great modern voices of Black America, and he's helping kind of merge the world sound into black music. A real pariah, bit of an outsider, a Detroit native. You gotta love Yusef Lateef's work. So as I was filming the new jazz sequence there, my phone ran out of memory at that Yusef Lateef 8234 or whatever it is. So we'll tack the rest of that series onto the next video. So y'all be safe. Have a great day. New jazz is great stuff. I know a lot of you collectors already know that. Stay tuned to the channel. Appreciate y'all. Subscribe if you haven't. Again, support Patreon if you want. Some cool t-shirts in the merchandise store in the description below. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.